So I guess I don't need to introduce myself, but really quickly, I want to talk about the experiences that I'm drawing from to sort of speak about kind of the practices of moderation. So for the past decade, I've been a community moderator of a bunch of subreddits, Facebook groups, Discords, and things like that, especially for communities of women and women in games and technology. So these are places that are very vulnerable to harassment. As well as some political forums. And then I've also been kind of coming out of that experience moderating. I've been writing guides for targets of harassment for 6 or 7 years, and then I started doing crisis support work for targets of harassment, as well as like community managers and influencers. And so now I work on trust and safety on sort of the platform side. And now I'm at Meedan, which is a nonprofit in sort of social technology. And now I'm working with these multi-stakeholder projects where we have people on the platform side, we have ethnographers, and we're trying to have a more holistic understanding of content moderation. And so what's really important is thinking about what those pathways are to responsible content moderation, given that we're working with such significant infrastructure and very limited opportunities in how to conform to certain types of standards in order to scale. So I'm going to start with the point of this talk, which is basically that experience matters. And experience with moderation, doing the work of it, managing your own harassment, and being falsely flagged by a moderation system is actually, those are really crucial experiences and actually kind of expertise that should be taken seriously in thinking about understanding and building moderation systems. And so I think a lot of us can agree about this on some level, like abstractly, but what I'm trying to dig into in this talk is like the details of what makes that true. And so what I think is also important is not just thinking about how we draw from experiences and use experiences as data, but also thinking about and designing towards experiences of people using your models or your systems that you're making. Because I think what's really important is not just thinking abstractly about, okay, we're detecting hate speech, but what are you detecting hate speech for, in what context, and for whom? And so as a huge pragmatist, I'm going to constantly talk about what these systems are like on the ground and how engaging with the deployment of systems is actually really important. And so when I mean, I guess, experience is expertise, I'm talking about a few things. So that's expertise in practice. So that's doing community moderation, content moderation, managing your harassment, doing community management, which is kind of just the paid version of moderation or community moderation. And actually, I want to probably explain community moderation, where it is where you are, a subreddit moderator is when you're a person in a subreddit that is responsible for moderating content. You're present in the subreddit community, and you're sort of visibly accountable to the people in your community. It's not the same as commercial content moderation, which is when you're hired by a corporation to sort of look at pieces individually, like different types of posts. So these are very different types of experiences. And then so there's expertise also in deployment. So that's people in trust and safety at platforms, people who are making systems, and in fact, people making third-party tools as well for moderation. And then finally, there's experiential expertise. It turns out that you kind of are an expert in your own experience. So, thinking about people coming from certain locations, speaking certain languages, what your identity or positionality is. If you've been harassed, you actually have a lot of knowledge about that experience. If you harass people, you have a lot of knowledge about it. And, being part of events and being embedded in a culture gives you a lot of knowledge about what is harassment in the context that you operate in. And so I want to start with the questions that I have working in NLP and content moderation. That comes especially from the fact that you kind of have to think relatively globally or and even kind of abstractly, where you have to think about, will it scale? And so you can have categories. So you have like cyberbullying and certain platforms and certain languages. And there isn't really a lot of demand for, create a moderation or machine learning tool for this very specific community. There's a lot of demand for generalized and scalable forms of automated moderation. And so the work of making something that will work for most people, I guess broadly, involves a lot of lofty decision making and a lot of speculation and high-level observation. And so here are questions that I often think about. And the reason I'm bringing these up is because these are the same questions we think about in community moderation. So in defining your target, where your target is like, okay, we're going to talk about hate speech or abuse or cyberbullying, how are you defining it? How are you operationalizing it? Are you doing this once? Are you iterating? Are you thinking about what it means for this context, what it means for this person, what it means during this time, like this event? And then how do you operationalize it in the sense of what does it mean to enforce? What are the details? Is hate speech slurs? Is hate speech, talking about, differences in the brain between people when you're not using violent language? So it really depends. And then data collection. Where are you collecting your data from? Is it Twitter, Reddit? And what things are you collecting? Is it individual comments? Is it an entire thread where you have the context around a single comment? Is it the network around the person who's leaving the comment? So you can kind of go into labeling when you're making a human annotated data set. What are the categories you're using? Are you giving people binary choices about yes or no? And then by whom? So who's doing the labeling of your data? Are they Mechanical Turk workers? Are they undergraduates that you trained? Are they you? And how are they trained? And in fact, like, what do you decide is the right answer? And for all these questions, like, why? Why are you deciding these things? What's informing your approach? And what are you doing this for? Computational methods I'm not going to touch, but testing what your model is, what's your test data set? Is it generated the same way that you made your training data set? So is it, operating under the same assumptions of how you trained your model? And what is your ground truth? And how do you determine what that is? And will it do what you theoretically want it to do? And how do you decide whether that's true? And so, and the implications, like, what does it mean when you have a certain result? Like, what kind of claims can you make about what it will do in the wild, or I guess, like, what abstractly you even want it to do? And it's insane to me that these questions can be answered without a million caveats, that you can sort of decide and keep a certain definition, and that there's a million ambiguously understood trade-offs that are happening during this process. But I mean, it's what we have to do, because the dominating framework is through these like massive online content moderation systems where you have to have these very discrete standards that can be enforced very efficiently and at tremendous scale. And so again, I'm bringing up these questions because this is exactly what we ask ourselves over and over in community moderation settings, as well as trust and safety professionals. And so it's an ongoing re-engagement with these questions as we do the work. And so do we even want to design globally? I don't think we do, but we kind of have to, so, oh well. And what happens with that is that then you're forced to over-index for what is most visible and what you can make the most consistent and what is kind of uncontroversially generalizable, so that can scale. So for example, like Twitter is a really popular place to scrape data from because it's very easy to collect data there, and it's very easy to see where harassment is. There, or at least we assume that there isn't a lot going on in DMs. Or maybe that it doesn't matter in the context under which we're making our models. And so in designing for everyone, whoops. Well, okay. In designing for everyone, you risk reflecting kind of the experiences of the dominant paradigm of kind of the homogeneous group that is most dominant in a population, especially when you say you have like five annotators for a data set and you want them all to agree and you decide by a vote. Are the majority of these people the average American? Are you selecting for marginalized people? Like, who are your labelers, and where they're coming from? And most people, I think, have to think about like what most people would think hate speech is, for example. And so then, you risk leaving people out who are at the margins, for whom hate speech looks very different, for whom hate speech affects them disproportionately. And so the trade-offs are really significant here. And again, it's like, what are your goals? Is it for designing for dealing with what people think hate speech is more broadly, or for people who are affected by it most? Are you thinking about in terms of people who are being stalked and harassed? Are you thinking about it in terms of how it affects culture? And that sort of affects how you decide that you want to train your model, and as well as like how you want to deploy it. And so moving on to actually the experience side of things, because I feel like talking abstractly about these things probably doesn't tell you much. So when working in trust and safety, I ended up working on reporting forms. So what people kind of, what they reported when they experienced harassment, so they said things like, or I don't know, they got options like like this person, it was harassment, or you could say, I don't like it, or it's harassing me or someone I know. And there's even a form that I saw where you could say hate speech was happening to you or harassment, but you couldn't select both of them. So you had to decide which one you were going to select. I think there's a strong parallel between the categories that you have to choose from reporting forms and the categories we kind of construct for labeling schemes. And what happens here is that we make very discrete choices. And when I was working at companies, we had to design for scale and for consistency and efficiency. And we kind of knew the trade-offs that we were making, but we kind of, our hands were very tied. And I think what's nice, though, about being in trust and safety is that we at least knew what we were doing. It made us feel very bad, but we had to kind of keep engaging, and I think that's really important in at least thinking about what we're doing and what we want to project for what we're doing in the future. And so then I ended up moving into, or simultaneously I was doing harassment support work for targets of harassment. So I actually went through those forms with people over and over and over again, and like no exaggeration, like 99% of the time, those reporting forms wouldn't let us reflect the experiences of the people who were being harassed. There's just no way you could enter anything that would cause like a judgment to actually be useful to you. You know, it wasn't even useful data, even if companies didn't act on it. And so it was deeply frustrating to me. And I think that, in fact, reporting forms, I think, in fact, are more informative than labeling systems in many cases, because these are people, rather than having a comment that is coded by a third party, this person is coding their own experience through what is happening to them. And even in that case, having these very restricted categories made it very difficult for them to get anywhere. So the only way that we could actually help them with harassment was for me to escalate to somebody I knew at a company so I could explain in great detail what the context was. And even then, they didn't really know what to do because there was no infrastructure to meet you know, the demands of a complex case. And so it was frustrating that the systems that we were using to collect that information kind of supported the same infrastructure that we had already built, and so there wasn't really a strong impetus or data being generated that encouraged us to create alternative systems, or at least gave us a blueprint for how to move forward creating alternative systems. And so what was really weird is that we actually wanted harassers to say something like hate speech. Like, we wanted them to be more, we wanted them to be worse, because it would at least give us a reason to report them and have it be taken down. And it turns out also people who are targets of harassment stop reporting after a certain point because, you know, nothing happens, or they don't trust companies anymore, they're afraid of retaliation. So there are a lot of elements of highly unreliable data that comes from positionality and labeling and conditions of labeling. And so what I'm really pointing to as well is that a lot of forms of harassment, a lot of forms of abuse and hate speech online are largely invisible, and are in fact rendered further invisible by focusing on what is very obvious and what we can sort of consistently label. And like I think that the cases that I was working with, it was very self-selected. They were very extreme cases, but they aren't trivial. So this is a Pew report that shows a percentage of U.S. adults who say they experience certain types of harassment. In the case of sustained harassment and stalking, it turns out those are cases that could not be sort of taken by reporting forms. And so you could see that I feel like there are pretty high percentages there. Like 13% of people age 18 to 29 have been stalked. That always seems really huge to me. And so I feel like I want to talk about invisibility in another way. And that's invisibility of people who harass through respectability. So I'm talking about sea lions, Richard Spencer, and scientific racism, which I will explain. So Taylor Swift had a music video that came out recently. Now the name escapes me. The music video was about kind of haters on the internet and being anti-LGBT. And so she actually characterized the haters as people that look like this. And so people like this are easy to villainize and identify and fixate on. But there's a strong growing culture online where hate speech and abuse looks like this. Like, he looks kind of like a weird, a benign professor. But that's Richard Spencer, who's a white nationalist and has been a huge motivator for the rise of the alt-right and a lot of hate happening in the US. And so then there's also something called scientific racism, and there's a sort of a growth in the use of strategic use of rational rhetoric. And so what happens here is that these look like sort of valid criticisms. They use language that is very measured, it's very careful, and in fact, even human raters or human labelers or people who see it who aren't familiar with the context might think like, oh, that's just a criticism, or that's just sort of an idle thought, rather than a strategic use of language to marginalize people further, which in combination with mob harassment, where many people are using this rhetoric towards a small group of people, is in fact very invasive. So there's this thing called Gamergate that happened in 2014, and I guess I'll explain it. I feel like, well, anyway, I'll explain it. So it was a movement in kind of the gaming culture where essentially a lot of people who were disproportionately like young white men did not like certain values of diversity and orienting towards narrative over mechanics and thinking about representation. They did not like this happening in games. And so it became a movement where people who were minorities and women were disproportionately harassed out of the industry. And what was really interesting is that they used a certain type of rhetoric. So there was a minority or a vocal minority of people, or it was still a lot of people who did use slurs, they did use hate speech, they did do really obvious harassment, but a large subset used the term ethics in gaming journalism. And so they talked about this kind of concern they had. They were concerned consumers that they cared about ethics in their space, and without having a background knowledge of what Gamergate was, you'd think like, oh yeah, no, I want ethics in games journalism. That's really reasonable. Unfortunately, there was a lot of attention on it publicly, so it became very obvious to most people involved. And so I think that what happens here, though, is that there are a lot of microcosms of this happening that are not visible and that are much harder to identify. And so to explain a little bit more, too, how reasonable sounding things can be very invasive and harassing is a thing called sea lioning, and it's based on this comment. I guess I'll explain it, where basically this woman is being being followed around by a sea lion who's saying like, so this woman says, I could do without sea lions. And then the sea lion says, pardon me, I couldn't help it over here. And she's like, oh no. He's like, I just want a civil conversation about your statement. And she's like, no, please go away. And he's like, there's no need to raise your voice. I'm right here. He follows her into her house where she's sleeping, and he's just constantly there. And like each kind of individual post, or I guess panel in this case, is again very innocuous sounding, but in aggregate, these things end up being very invasive again, and often manifest on the internet through things like comments, through private messages, through things that happen across many platforms and among many people. So Gamergate had a thing called Operation Disrespectful Nod. They still have a Google document online that is a guide for people who identify with Gamergate to look respectable. And this has been around since 2014. So they had a big campaign to try to get various people fired from their companies. And so they gave a lot of the people in the movement this guide to look respectable, and just to appear as a concerned consumer, to make it look natural, to not make it look coordinated, and to be like very compelling as being concerned, and maybe that they're marginalized themselves. And this actually succeeded. So what happened was they were trying to get Intel to stop funding a game website. And Intel, in fact, did stop funding that website when they got enough of these emails. The only reason that Intel reversed their decision was because the press picked it up and they made Intel look really bad. And so the problem here again is that it's actually the people that are still having trouble identifying and labeling. It's at this point it's still not just a matter of complex sentences or network analysis that is the context that we need. And in addition to that, by the way, like where hate speech and a lot of obvious harassing language manifested was in private communities. So people still use these terms, they just knew publicly not to. Another moment where these types of things happened was the Learn to Code harassment campaign, where a bunch of people harassed journalists who got fired from BuzzFeed by telling them to learn to code, which again sounds pretty normal, but in the context of people being fired from BuzzFeed, looking for jobs, telling people condescendingly and en masse learn to code ended up being a really potent harassment campaign. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that we should be designing systems for heterogeneity. So rather than thinking of a global that we're trying to consistently create standards around and enforce, is thinking about how can systems adjust to different contexts. And so again, what's really important is engaging with and meeting those needs of these specific contexts, different experiences, times, rather than just thinking about what is applicable to everything. And so how do you find that out? It turns out that might be actually experiencing it or working with people who do. And so community moderation is the context that I'm using to demonstrate a lot of these principles. And I think I need to talk faster. So I started a subreddit community 10 years ago called Girl Gamers. It's a community for women in games. And again, I was there. It's kind of like being a community leader, but you're responsible for banning people, explaining things to people, but also doing like really proactive, nice things in the community. So I'll be pulling a lot of examples from here. So when thinking about creating and operationalizing definitions or policies, in contrast to kind of traditional methodologies around labeling or making definitions, the questions that we asked ourselves over and over, what purpose are we defining our policies and definitions for, and for whom? Why are we doing this, and where is it happening? And sometimes it actually matters when. And so we didn't get it right for a long time, and I don't really know if we've gotten it right now, because like the community changed, we were learning because we didn't have expertise in this space, because I think this was one of my earlier moments in moderation. The culture changed, like pre and post Gamergate, people became very different. The size of the community changed the nature of it, and our own priorities changed, as well as like our definitions of what was acceptable versus not acceptable. And so these are different iterations of our rules, like a month apart, where we would change the language, and we would kind of think about the ways to explain things or add and take away things. This is the current policy that we have. So you can see that it's kind of changed a lot over time. And it's not because we necessarily had it wrong the whole time, but again, our community has changed a lot in character. So we realized that a lot of men were just messaging women out of the blue. So we had to make a post like, don't like just message women if you're a man here out of the blue. Don't make posts that are promoting yourself outside of our weekly promotion threads and things like that, because we found that people like didn't understand it or they didn't realize. And so we spent an extraordinary amount of time because we had our own IRC channel, or like some kind of chat room where a bunch of the moderators were just constantly talking. We'd be like, okay, I can't decide what to do with this one. What do you think? It's like, well, we did this with this person last time, but it turns out like we actually had it wrong. It turns out they weren't being harassed. I don't know. So there were many cases where we had to kind of learn, and we would disagree a lot. And we would pull from different examples in our own experiences. And we would try it out. And so an example is that we first started with the ethos of being an education-oriented community. Reddit was, at the time, in 2010, 2010 was like largely like 99% white men. So we were like, well, this would be a good education space, right? People can talk about like differences in the brain between men and women, so we could sort of patiently talk through like, well, this is actually not the case for X reason. And we actually were open to people asking questions about the people who are trans, because that was really important as an educational project. But especially later on and through Gamergate, it ended up being a very violating experience in the community, so we decided we're not going to have those kind of questions around anymore. We're orienting around being a more protected space and having, certain values. And so the point is that it was like an ongoing engagement, and it turns out even between local communities, we had very different norms versus global ones. So I moderated a thing called political discussion versus Girl Gamers. And also this is important on a platform level because Facebook is moving into groups where there is a lot of local moderation. So platforms are very much moving in this direction to cope with the fact that global norms are not actually very effective. And so what's really important here is like a more examples of what we had to do was thinking about, well, maybe we shouldn't remove this post that technically violates our policy because everybody downvoted it anyway. So it demonstrated that this was not a value that we had, but it was still public to show that that was not a value we had. And so these are different moderation posts I left where in Girl Gamers, I'd say, hey, we appreciate you being mindful, don't do this. In political discussion, we had really strict rules, and so we said, thanks for your contributing. Is this a form letter, basically? We had hit these things like submissions must discuss a political topic. In Girl Gamers, this would be very alienating, but in political discussion, it worked for us. In the UC Irvine subreddit, somebody was impersonating a professor, so I had to go investigate, and I had to quarantine the subreddit, and we actually had to go to the class to ask him if it was him. And then also saying like, hey there, friend. This was 2 years ago. I removed this thread and temp banned this person as final warning, and so I explained my rationale. I intervened with that person privately, and they ended up becoming one of the greatest champions of our policies in the subreddit. In 2X Chromosomes, a very women-oriented subreddit, we removed posts that asked for medical advice, saying nobody here is qualified to give you advice. And so these kinds of approaches ended up generalizing also to platform perspectives. Discord actually kind of uses this model in having community specialists where they do constantly renegotiate policies. They make regular time for deliberation and actually work very closely with the technical team to build the tools and automation around the work that they're doing. And so I'm going to go through this really quickly. What was really important is also thinking tools for moderators rather than tools that necessarily are meant to replace moderators. And so we actually ended up, during Gamergate, having these very specific rules where we knew what to expect from the automation that we were using. In this case, it was a very temporarily situated situation where we decided to have posts that might be violating content immediately banned, as opposed to like leaving it up and just flagging it for us. We eventually took that away once Gamergate calmed down and wasn't mobbing our subreddit as much, and so we changed it into being more cautious. But we wanted to know consistently what we could expect from our automation. And then, these are some of our moderator practices where we can have very detailed notes about people with various scalability. We'd have very simple metrics that we kind of use and develop our own heuristics. Reddit ended up having to implement a reporting system where users could leave you moderation notes to basically explain why, because having the category, and this example is weird, having the category and just the report wasn't enough information. You had to know why the person was reporting it, because the text itself didn't tell you enough. This is not a good example, but this is just to show you what reports look like. And then finally, thinking about, and one thing I want to make sure to also emphasize is that these are all third-party tools that Reddit later integrated. And so these tools came out of moderators being tired of scripting a bunch of things, and they just made an interface for it so all the moderators could use it. And so a final example is a Twitch auto moderator, which So Twitch, I just realized I have to explain what Twitch is. It's a streaming service where people stream games, and then there's like a live chat that goes up. So that chat needs to be moderated. And so moderators would have a lot of bots that they would program. They'd use regular expressions and blacklists and things. But then Twitch introduced AutoMod, which was using machine learning. And you could designate different levels of severity or levels of strictness that you wanted the moderator, auto moderator to capture. And so what ended up happening is that in bigger Twitch streams with bigger chats, the moderators defaulted to the bots that they customized themselves. Because with the auto moderator, it actually, they did not know how to predict what it would do, so it actually created more labor for them because it didn't actually integrate very well with their practices. And so the only reason that people often used it was actually because of the interface element. The auto moderator would hold messages for you, whereas the bots had to wait till somebody posted it and then take it down. And so it just helped that, it was an interface issue on the Twitch side, and, but it didn't actually meet a lot of the needs that people had. So what I'm getting at here is thinking about our current models of moderation versus aspirationally what we want. And thinking about balancing current models of scalable moderation, because we have to, because the infrastructure's there, we can't change it much. But also enabling tooling and metrics and infrastructure that can support heterogeneous moderation where, we can situate our work to like local and temporal contexts. And so when you're building systems, like, do you think that your system is supporting potentially these aspirational forms of moderation, or are they foreclosing it? Are they making it actually more difficult to make these types of moderation that use expert people that are actually much better to adjusting to context? And so finally, the way that I'm grappling with it at Meedan is that we are kind of thinking about how to add context to content moderation. And one of the first things we're doing is building a toy data set where we are building a series of case studies around experiences of harassment with people who are ethnographers from the communities that they come from, and of people who have the same identity as them. So they have the experiences, but they also have expertise in expressing those experiences systematically, and as well as thinking about its implications for design. And I think what's really crucial here is thinking about these overlaps of experiences where people who have experiences are not just your research subjects or data points, but they are actually co-conspirators and collaborators. And so I think, we're grappling with all these issues over here. And so finally, thinking about expert systems versus systems that support experts, and that these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think that's a framework we have to think about. Instead of replacing people, we could be supporting people who are good at doing this work, when in many cases we're very far from systems being able to do that entirely themselves. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much.